Welcome to the Jericho Force podcast, where we learn how to integrate faith into the work that we do. Don't conform to the world's way of doing business. Transform by doing business God's way. Here's our host, my husband, author, speaker, teacher, encourager, and stewardship coach, Jason Davis.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Jason Davis, aka Mr. Fortify, and welcome to another episode of the Jericho Force podcast, where we talk about how we integrate faith into the work that we do. I'm really excited about this episode we have coming up because we're going to talk about many things, but if you've ever heard of blogging, maybe you think that's old school, but my guest here has a different opinion on the power of blogging amongst many other topics in the online and digital space. But before I bring him on, let me introduce him to you. Brandon Gaille is the host of the Blogging Millionaire podcast. His blogs get over 6 million monthly visitors. He started an SEO software company called RankIQ a year and a half ago. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Jericho Force podcast, Mr. Brandon Gaille. Brandon, what's going on, man?
Not much. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So excited to have you on, Brandon, and especially because your expertise online and with regards to blogging, some people in the online space consider blogging a little bit archaic, but you have proven otherwise, and blogging is very much alive. So I'm excited to have that conversation. You know, Brandon, I know where you are presently. That's not where you always were. So give us a little background on how you got into what you're doing now.
Well, it's kind of a long story, but I'll summarize it. In my 20s, I was a serial entrepreneur, and I started a couple of multi-million-dollar companies. And as I was approaching 30, I started to have a bunch of different health issues, and no one could figure it out. And within about 3 or 4 years, I was brought to the point of being definitely my mental ability was no longer there. I was approaching being mentally handicapped and had physical limitations at the same time. And all the success and money that was made from those other companies had gone away because I was an entrepreneur. And once my mental ability was no longer there, I was thinking I still had the ability to make good decisions, but I made bad decisions. And quickly, I was eventually $500,000 into debt and unable to work or have any type of business because my mind was no longer there. And then after that, I took a while to get myself back to where I could start a business. And before that, we didn't know what was going on with my health. And finally, a doctor, who's about the 100th doctor that I had seen, was mentioned to my wife, and I went to see him, and he was kind of on the fringe doing some experimental things with a rare disease disorder called dysautonomia. And he diagnosed me with that and started me on this mix of medicine. And I started sleeping about 18 to 20 hours a night. And what had happened was the dysautonomia that I had kind of been there since my 20s. And what it was doing was disrupting my sleep up to about 1,000 times a night, but they were micro disruptions. So I was just kind of waking up but never going into deep sleep. And what happened was I had a 6 or 7 year sleep deficit, which was causing me to be mentally disabled because of lack of sleep. The medication allowed me to just sleep and try to work off that sleep deficit. Remember, my wife said she called the doctor because she thought I was dying, and he had to explain to her that I'm gonna be sleeping an enormous amount for a while. But what happened was about a month and a half after I started taking that medication, I had a mental awakening to where I was able to start thinking for myself and make good decisions. And it was it was basically God just jumping in there because he was going to have to use me for something bigger. And what it turned out was my wife was 3 months pregnant with her first child, and she noticed a little red mark and a little nodule about the size of an eraser on her breast. So we went to see a couple of doctors. They thought it had to do with something with pregnancy and hormones. But once they ended up doing a biopsy, it determined it was cancer. And within a 30-day period of when she initially noticed it, and it was the size of an eraser, it had grown to the size of an orange. So cancer was on supercharged by all of her pregnancy hormones. And we went to see the first doctor at MD Anderson, and they said it was stage 3 inflammatory breast cancer. They gave her like a 60% 2-year survival rate. And she was pretty down about that. So we got a second opinion at Baylor, and Baylor came back with a 40% survival rate. And I just felt like something was going on and something wasn't right. And I remember that day I had another doctor's appointment for myself. And I told the front desk that, hey, I needed to get in and get out of here because of what's going on with my wife. And the doctor had overheard it. And when he came into the room, he asked to sit down with me and pray over me. And at that point, I wasn't a Christian, so I was thankful that someone was praying over me. And it was very emotional because he just said he was asking for God to intervene and do something. And I went home that day, and I just felt led to go to Google and start doing searching everything I could to try to find anything on women with breast cancer that were pregnant. And within just an hour or two, I had found a study that showed that there were misdiagnoses on the type of the stage of cancer because of the pregnancy hormones, making it seem like it was stage 3 inflammatory, stage 4 inflammatory, but it was still stage 0. And at the time, the doctors had told my wife and I that they weren't even going to worry about our baby surviving. They said, we have to treat the patient. The patient is my wife, and we're going to have to aggressively go after this with immediate chemo and possible radiation. And we're not worried about the survival of the fetus, they said at the time. So I just after reading this, I felt like they were wrong. And I called the Baylor doctor and asked to come in that day. And we came in that day, and I told them that I found this study and that I believe that they're wrong, and it's not stage 3 inflammatory breast cancer, that it's still stage 0. And he listened to me, and then he asked me if I was a doctor or some type of medical researcher. And then I just said, no, I used to be an entrepreneur a long time ago. I'm pretty good at solving things. But it was clear that God was using me at that point and answering the prayer of the doctor that prayed over me the day before. And the Baylor doctor looked at me like he felt sorry for me. And I asked him, I said, what happens if you did a needle biopsy at 20 points on the tumor and they all came back inconclusive? Because at that point, the biopsies were inconclusive. So they were basing the stage 3 inflammatory breast cancer on the size and the growth rate. So he said it's not going to make a difference because my wife is going to have a full mastectomy that week. And he said, we'll number up and do it, but the results aren't going to be what you're looking for, but I'll do it just so you all have peace of mind. And they did a rush on it. And a day later, the results came back inconclusive. And so they have a special cancer board that meets on unique situations that are timely, like my wife's. And they determined that it was stage 0 and that they weren't going to do radiation or chemotherapy, that they would just do the mastectomy. And a couple days later, she had the mastectomy, and in December of that year, so the mastectomy was in June, December 23rd of that year, she was declared cancer-free, and wow. She's been cancer-free ever since.
My goodness, Brandon. That is so many thoughts going through my mind as you were sharing that. Number one, I appreciate your transparency. I know sometimes thinking about the things that we've come out of, it's difficult to come back to the headspace, but there was a couple of things that I noted. One, just the whirlwind of emotions that you and your wife experienced. Also, at some point when you talked about the prayer that the doctor had prayed, and at the time not having faith in God, but there was a shift that took place. And you had an unbelievable amount of grit that you showed, being a problem solver. So that was something that really stood out to me in your problem solving, the amount of grit that you had to just not accept. And this is not a knock at doctors, but just to not accept what was said, and that to really get to the bottom of the diagnosis. Those were just some of the themes that, as you were sharing, that really came across. For you, that's just what I noticed. For you, what were a couple of those turning points while you and your wife were going through all of that?
Well, I think it was just a very tough to hear the doctors, this being our first child, and the doctors basically writing off our child as just a part of the process. And then just the way God works, he can use people that aren't completely believers at the time. And just looking back on it, how I wasn't able to, I had trouble completing sentences. That's how mentally disabled I was at the time. And for him to put me in front of that obscure doctor and to awaken my mind so that he could use me at the moment and get in there and basically take over and tell the doctors they're wrong, and this is how he'll prove them wrong, because I had no business talking to one of the top breast cancer doctors in the world and saying, hey, you're wrong, and on top of that, here's a new procedure I want you to do by taking biopsies at 20 different points of a tumor to determine that this diagnosis is wrong. There's no way it could be described that I, being the person that I am, the limited knowledge I had of anything medicine, and then on top of that, being mentally disabled just a few months before that, to come in there and find this study, identify that, hey, they're wrong, and then tell them the medical procedure to do it. I mean, it's just all God.
That's huge, Brandon. And it's just so funny now, because we're about to get into all the wonderful work you do now. How do you think that that boldness, how does that translate to what you do now, getting into the online and digital space? What preparation do you think that did for where you are now?
I think God put me where he wanted me to be. I know before I was saved, I had the blogs, and they were doing okay, but nothing like they've been in the past 4 or 5 years. And the way I was running the blogs, it was more about the goal is to get traffic and to make money. Mm-hmm. But after I was saved and I started to understand who Jesus was and who he wants me to be, I kind of changed my mindset of I need to create the best piece of content for the person that's reading it. and I'm not worrying about how fast I can knock out web with posts or how much money it's going to cost. I am serving my audience. So I went from the goal of making money to the goal of serving my audience. And that was the beginning of the foundation for having tremendous success as a blogger. And I guess being a new Christian, I would think a lot of new Christians struggle with tithing. And that was the struggle that I had, where I was surrendering everything else, but I wasn't surrendering my finances. And that first year, I tried to figure out a way to say, okay, I'm going to give my 10% by offering 10% off of my online course. And I'm going to say 10% goes to this charity. Still trying to control it myself. And after a year of that, I finally realized I've got to surrender everything. And I surrendered my finances and just gave the 10% to the church that year. And within a month, I received an email from one of my people taking my course telling me that I should change the ads that I use for my blogs. And I changed the ads for my blogs, and that increased the income I was making by 700% from my blogs. You always hear, oh, yeah, God will give you the blessing. But for me, I mean, it was just loud and clear, immediate. And my wife was a lawyer at the time, and she wasn't good with the tithing. And I thought she'd never be good with the tithing because she was so much against it. But at the same time, I was kind of against it a year before that. But because that happened with me, and she saw the blessing that I had with my blog income, the next year, she tithed her income also. So it's a process. It wasn't immediate. Everything changes, but it was just initially it became serving and that servant leadership with everything that I did and getting better at it. And then as each year passed, just identifying more ways that I can be a better Christian and also be more comfortable with sharing the gospel. Because I had the podcast also before that, and I called it the Blogging Millionaire before I became a Christian. If I was a Christian before I named my podcast, I wouldn't have called it the Blogging Millionaire. But I have all these people coming to my podcast, and they see Blogging Millionaire for the first time, and they're money motivated also. And it's not like the Christian blog podcast where everybody that comes to my podcast is already Christian. So I'm in front of over 10,000 bloggers, with the majority of them aren't Christian. And after I guess 2 or 3 years of being a Christian, I recognize that I don't need to go and start my own ministry or become a preacher. That God put me in front of an audience, and I need to use that. And I had I think it was my 100th podcast episode that I shared my testimony and everything that kind of happened with God moving, and with the cancer situation all the way up until that point, and how it's really impacted my life. And that was kind of the turning point to where I started with my personal blog. I put my About Me page and pulled people in with how I got to 5 million monthly visitors with my blog. But once they were in there, I started talking about how God has moved in my life, because it was a timeline of who I was when I started my blog to where I am now. And that timeline includes God and Jesus Christ. And I recognize that if I'm going out of my way to make sure that bloggers know about certain tips and tactics and how important that is, in the grand scheme of things for success as a blogger, for me, my most success came from surrendering my life to Jesus Christ and becoming a servant leader. And that's where I saw the traffic and income go through the roof. I couldn't hold that back. And that was a big turning point for me, because now I didn't worry about what people were going to say. And what was interesting is every time on my blog, when I do share my testimony in some way, shape, or form. I do get people that will make a review and call me a zealot and complain about how I'm just pushing Jesus. And I actually feel good when I feel kind of like with Paul and what he teaches in Scripture. When that's a badge of honor, and I recognize that those people that made that comment and the review, they are lost right now, and I'm making them think about God so much that they have to write it down in a review. So those are some of the ways that God has moved within my blog and the podcast.
My goodness, Brandon, so many gems that you shared there. Amazing how faith permeates into everything that we do, affecting all the way down to your finances, husband and wife getting on the same page after not, like you said, it was a journey. You didn't just all of a sudden get there, and God just opening the door and just showing and revealing to you and your wife. So that's powerful. And then even just the posture of having a heart to serve. Like, yeah, I'm a business, I make money, but if I just focus on serving the customer as best I can, and God has allowed your income to spike in unimaginable ways. So that's powerful, Brandon. As we get into the blogging side, Brandon, what are your thoughts? There's a lot of gurus out here that talk about all the different content types and marketing strategies, but it's evident what you have done online. So what do you say to all that online rhetoric there? Sometimes it can feel like the wild, wild west, but where do you think blogging stands in light of all the different media trends?
Oh, when it comes to blogging, when I started my first blog in 2013, there were articles all over the place saying that you're too late to do anything. The blog has been around too long. So it's always been there. But what I can say is over the closer decade that I've been blogging, things have come and gone over and over and over again. With Facebook, it used to be able to just have a Facebook page and get traffic from that. And over time, they pushed it to nothing but ads. So unless you're a Fortune 5,000 company or someone with a big ad budget, you're not going to get traffic from Facebook. And then people shifted to Pinterest, and people started using Pinterest to get that organic traffic. And then the same thing happened in the last couple of years. So as all these other platforms have gone away, and Instagram is making the same transition right now, blogging has been there. And in particular when it comes to blogging and ranking on Google. And over time, what has happened is, going back to the early 2000s, you had a lot of people just trying to rank on Google by dumping a bunch of keywords in there. And then you had spamming with backlinks, buying backlinks to different pages to get it to rank. But over this 15, 20-year period, what has happened is Google has continued to tweak their algorithm to where today it's all about quality content. If you have quality content and you have the best piece of content for a specific topic, eventually that rises to the top. Now, what is for new blogs, you can't compete for certain keywords. Like, you're not going to write a post about the best credit cards to use if you just started a blog and rank for that. It's just not going to happen. So what I've been doing since 2013 has just been becoming an expert at keyword research and identifying the keywords that get significant traffic that have low competition. And I started with 80% of my posts were low competition keywords the first year. And then after that first year, I noticed that 99% of my traffic were coming from those 80% of keywords So I then shifted it to 90 to 95%. I've been doing that ever since. And then with the software that I created, RankIQ, the big difference point there is that we go through and identify all the high traffic, low competition keywords for every blogging niche. So from food to travel, and then travel's broken down. So if you just blog about Texas or Florida, we have all those keywords there. So they don't have to go and do all the complicated equations and algorithms to find them with other keyword tools. So a blogger can just go in there, choose their niche, grab a keyword, and then know what they need to write about. But that's the one thing that is the difference point for my blogs. People that have taken my course and, of course, my software, it really comes down to the foundation of making sure you're writing on a topic that, number one, gets traffic, and number two, that has low competition that you can rank for. Because you don't want to spend 6-8 hours writing an incredible, beautiful post on a keyword that either doesn't get traffic or you can't rank for.
My goodness, a mouthful of goodness you just shared, Brandon. With you starting RankIQ, what are you most excited about? Because you're solving a very unique problem, Brandon. Like you said, you percentage-wise, you went from 80 all the way up to 95%, and you just can't start a blog and compete for the existing keyword. So with you kind of zoning in on that, what's been most exciting with RankIQ?
I'll tell you, the most exciting thing has been that God is in charge. And the story is that the way the idea of RankIQ came up, it was just completely divine. I still, with my sleeping disorder and dysautonomia, I still have to take a bunch of medicine and a shot before I go to bed, and then medicine at the halfway point to keep me down. And so when I wake up after being in bed for 10 hours, the first hour or two, I'm still heavily sedated. And so I really don't do any type of serious business stuff. But the night before I went to sleep, when I came up with, or when God gave me the idea for RankIQ, I had clearly the worst idea I've ever had in my life. But at the time, I thought it was a great idea that I would go from having these blogs and having an online course and a podcast. And I thought to myself, I want to create a clothing company that focuses on boxers, and I want the boxers to be kilt boxers. And I actually even wrote it on a Post-it note that start a kilt boxer company. And the next morning, as soon as I woke up, I had the entire vision for RankIQ, and I went upstairs to my whiteboard and wrote the whole thing out. And then I just executed upon that. And I knew God had a plan. I didn't know what his plan was. And so every time, so we've got all the keywords in there. And when someone chooses a keyword, they can click a button that says Run Report. And that runs an artificial intelligence report and tells them what to put in their content and helps them create the outline. And so anyone that's a user of RankIQ, they get 16 reports each month. And so each user is doing 16 reports. And before I launched the service, I felt God tell me what to do. And it was when the report is running, because it takes 2 minutes. So during that 2-minute time, you have a captive audience. They're sitting there and watching the computer as it's saying until 100% is complete, and then it shows them the report. During those 2 minutes, I have a box come up that rotates through a blogging or SEO tip, and then a motivational quote kind of tied to blogging and something. So 2 very relevant things. And then the third thing is a biblical verse. So what happens is when they're waiting for the report, every time they're seeing at least two verses, and I'm not just pushing verse. They're pulled in with, they're seeing the blogging tip, the motivational quote, and then a Bible verse. So right now we do about 20,000 reports a month by our users. So 20,000 times people are seeing scripture over and over. And so that makes it even more special to be working for a business that has a kingdom purpose, and it's amplified because our audience is bloggers. So these people have anywhere from 10,000 to 1 million monthly visitors to their sites. And you have, on one hand, the non-believer who's getting exposed to it and thinking about it. But on the other hand, you have the believer who, and a lot of them have come to me and told me, because you're putting Jesus out there with your business, with your podcast, I'm going to do it more with my blog, and I'm going to share my faith and my testimony through my email list, through my blog post. And so it's not just the people that are using RankIQ, but the users and their blogs and the people that come to their blogs that's being affected. So that knowing that the business just isn't about making money and serving, which is great, but having that kingdom purpose in there really makes it extra special.
Love that, Brandon. That's exactly what we talk about here on my podcast, integrating faith in the work that we do. And I like how you mentioned earlier, it's not, certain people are called to be a pastor or an evangelist, but I think there's something to be said, Brandon, about there's many people who God put a burning desire and purpose in their heart to be men and women of impact in the marketplace specifically, and to minister through doing excellent work, providing good products and services, and then sprinkling in the gospel along the way and being unashamed. So I love everything that you're saying, Brandon. Brandon, as we're in the back half of 2022 now, I feel like this year is blown by. What are some upcoming events or programs or things that you have on the docket for the rest of the year?
And primarily, I'm just doing more of the same. My podcast, I've transitioned over the last 2 years to where I stopped doing my online course that I used to charge people for, and I'm just kind of doing the online course through my podcast. My podcast isn't interview based. It's just me teaching for 10, 20 minutes per episode. And now my episodes have series. So I have a 6-part series on building backlinks, a 4-part series on how to update a blog post to move up higher in the rankings. So that's a big part of my process, just getting better and delivering higher quality content that's easier to absorb and help bloggers go to the next level. And then with RankIQ, just continuing to work with my dev team and adding more features and making it better. It's just there's so many ideas I have that are already on the docket for giving it to my developers, and it's just going through that one at a time. And the bottom line is serving my audience, whether it's through the podcast or through RankIQ, and not sitting back and going, yeah, things are great. We've got enough money to stop working. It's not about making money. It's just finding new ways to serve and serving my audience better.
That is awesome, Brandon. I greatly appreciate what you shared today. I feel like everything that you said, sharing your testimony and how God has worked in you and through you, this is going to bless a lot of kingdom business owners out there. Maybe that they're afraid, or they're trying to figure out ways to be bold about their faith. And I feel like you've given us a great example. So I thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing today.
In regards to anyone that's on the fence about sharing the gospel through their business, what I found is, I guess initially I was worried that it was going to negatively affect my business. And once I got past that, my wife had the same worry that, okay, this could affect our family's income if you do this. But once doing this and putting the gospel out there for the last 3-4 years through my podcast and now through RankIQ, you get more business because there's so many Christians out there already. And when they see someone putting Jesus out there and talking about the gospel, they are committed to just being part of your business. And I've had people tell me, even if our software stopped working, that they would continue paying just because of what I'm doing. And wow. So I recommend just recognizing that you will get people that will send you nasty emails and tell you how you're a zealot and that that's not the place for that. And you just can't allow those to change the course, because in any business, you're going to have unhappy customers no matter how great your business is. Mm-hmm. And you can't let 5 or 10 people that tell you that you shouldn't be sharing biblical verses or pointing to Jesus with your business, or just making sure that you choose things in your business that are in line with biblical teachings, because there's lots of businesses out there where you're going to be tempted to serve a certain audience or do something that, while it's completely legal and ethical business-wise, it is not in line with what Scripture teaches us. Mm-hmm. So I think, number one, God's going to bless you, and even if whatever blessing that you miss out by pointing to Jesus with your business or whatever that you do, you're going to get it 10 to 100 fold in heaven when that time comes. And that's the great thing, that if you rest on that hope, that it'll be easier for you to take the plunge and point to Jesus. There's been no greater feeling in my life than when I point someone to Jesus in any way, shape, or form, whether it's in person, with my business, with my podcast.
Love it, Brandon. That's true words of wisdom right there. Before we leave, Brandon, you're doing all this great work. What's the best way for listeners to connect with you and everything that you're doing?
The best way is just to follow me on my podcast. I do an episode once a week, and that podcast is the Blogging Millionaire. So whatever podcast app that you use, you can do a search for blogging or Blogging Millionaire, and it'll come up, and click and follow.
Excellent. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the Jericho Force podcast. This is going to be an excellent episode for people to hear, and we will definitely be in touch, Brandon, for sure.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we leave things here on the Jericho Force podcast. Don't conform to the world's way of doing business. Transform by doing business God's way. We'll see you next time on the Jericho Force podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Jericho Force podcast. You can catch us live on Wednesdays at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time and on demand. Check out jerichoforce.com/podcast for more details. To learn how to live out your faith in the marketplace, grab a copy of Jason Davis's book, Fortify, Being Rooted in God's Plan for Work and Business, available on Amazon.